recording and then great. Thank you. So welcome everybody to the MVC Joint Affordable Housing Group meeting. Today is Wednesday, November 8th, and we are very lucky to have as our special guest today, Shelley Gearing, who is a member of Mass Housing Partnership and will be presenting today on how CPCs, Affordable Housing Trusts, and Affordable Housing Committees can work together in a more coordinated fashion to maximize efficiency, efficacy, and also leverage state contributions for our projects. So we are recording this, so I'll send this out to all the affordable housing committees afterwards. Please share this with the other committees in your town, all the boards and committees in the town. And if Shelley has any visuals, I'll also make sure to send the slide deck out to everyone afterwards. And the video will be posted on our YouTube channel, on the MVC YouTube channel. And with that, I will turn it over to Shelley.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to be with you. I do have some slides, so I'm going to share my screen, and I know I have way too many slides, so I'm so sorry if it ends up feeling like information overload. So I'm perfectly fine with being interrupted if there are questions, or if you want to have some conversation. If you want to have some conversation. So Laura and Lucy, if you want to kind of manage that, but feel free to interrupt if that feels appropriate. Also, if it becomes too much and I start seeing some glazed eyes, then I maybe will skip some slides, but there's just a lot that I wanted to try to cover with you. So just a little bit of MHP for those of you who are not familiar. I suspect that most of you are. MHP is a quasi-state agency in Massachusetts, and we have 4 main kind of external facing teams at MHP. We have the Center for Housing Data, a small group of people who collect, analyze, and share data to help inform, hopefully, more effective housing policy on the local, regional, and state level. We have a community assistance team that I'm a part of, and we're really focused on helping to build the capacity on the local level to support affordable housing. We also work with housing authorities as well as nonprofit organizations that are working on developing affordable housing. We have a lending team that's lent over $1.4 billion to support the creation and preservation for 27,000 units of affordable rental housing. We really focus on rental. And then we have a homeownership team that manages the One Mortgage and One Plus. And we've also been managing some Mass Dreams funds as well from the state to help more people access homeownership in Massachusetts. So today I am going to cover a few things. One, just some very basics around housing trust funds and getting a little bit into trust operations and best practices. So given all the time that we've spent working in many different communities that have housing trusts, just wanted to offer some suggestions from trusts that are kind of the more effective trusts. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time just getting into eligible activities, the kinds of things that your trust specifically, as well as your CPC, can be funding. And then I'd like to just give some suggestions about how our housing boards can work collaboratively, town by town, as well as in different regions. So that's what we're going to go through. So first, just some housing trust basics, and I'm not going to get too much into this. I know that some of you have had a trust for quite a while, but they are public entities. The municipal affordable housing trust funds organized under Chapter 44, Section 55C. They are public entities. They're municipal boards. They're created by your local legislative body, just with a majority vote. The purpose of a trust is actually, I think, pretty narrow. That is to create and preserve affordable housing for low and moderate income households. It's actually not, it's not everything housing. It really is about creating and preserving affordable housing. It's led by a board of trustees appointed locally. And because it's a municipal board, like all of your other boards, it's subject to public procurement, designer selection, conflict of interest, and public meeting laws, which is a big reason why, along with being a volunteer board, is why we never suggest that a trust actually be the developer of affordable housing. So very overarching, what a trust fund can do is to address some of your affordable housing needs in your community, in your region. It can support local control of housing initiatives. And the trust can engage in real estate activity. The trust can buy and sell property if that is appropriate. Unless your bylaw says otherwise, the trust can make timely decisions, does not have to go back to the select board. And that can be an advantage in the real estate market. It can also just be an advantage of responding to developers in a more readily than typically a community preservation committee can. And as a municipal board, the trust can be collecting funds from a variety of sources. And we're seeing communities get more and more creative around funding their trust, which is fantastic. The statute is very short. The trust statute is very short, and it doesn't offer a lot of specifics in terms of trustees. It just is a minimum of 5, which includes the chief executive officer. In towns, that would be a member of the select board. Trustees are appointed by the mayor, but in some city structures, the city council has some oversight, and in towns, the select board. The statute specifies 2-year terms, and communities typically will stagger those so that there's never the situation where everybody is turning over in the same year. And then just like your other boards, trustees are considered public agents. They're special municipal employees. The statute gives 16 different powers for the trust. We suggest that communities not modify these too much because it can really detract from really the benefit of having a housing trust. But there certainly are cases where communities have modified powers a little bit. And so you just want to make sure that you're always looking at your local bylaw for specifics. Typically, a modification would be something like with the power to be able to borrow, there are oftentimes restrictions of needing 2/3 vote of trustees, or in some cases, wanting the select board to be able to have oversight of borrowing. And then I just wanted to point out, because all of your communities have CPA that was written into the trust statute several years ago to require that trusts report back to CPCs on an annual basis about how you're spending CPA funds. And the intent of this really is to make sure then that CPCs are then reporting to the state using the CP3 report to the Department of Revenue, how funds that were transferred to a trust are being spent for housing. Because what's happened in the state is a lot of funds have been transferred, CPA funds have been transferred to trusts, and that it just is this loss of information about how those funds are being utilized. And then when we're going to advocate for additional CPA funds, a higher match, the data for housing is not really clear. So it's now in the statute where trusts have to be reporting back as you're spending the funds, so on an annual basis. And the screenshot that you see on this slide is a document that I developed in partnership with Stuart Saganor at the Community Preservation Coalition to help trusts answer all the questions that the CPC needs to put in the CP3 form. So it's using the same language. And then we also have a document that explains how to fill out the form, which seems like it should not be difficult, but it actually is, can be a bit challenging. So just an FYI to remind your communities if you're not remembering that. And then just 2 quick tips is we always suggest, because you're allocating public resources, that you always have a grant agreement, whether this is just the CPC's allocations, whether it's a CPC transferring funds to the trust, and also if the trust is allocating funds towards developments, that you make it your parameters for the fund distribution clear in an agreement. And just a heads up, if you're not familiar with this, that the CPA area median income numbers may differ from HUD's numbers. The state just uses HUD's 100% area median income and then a straight 80% of that. But HUD has different kind of formula that they use to come up with 80% of the area median income. So if you're in a position where you're wanting developments to count on the subsidized housing inventories with the state, you always want to make sure that you're using HUD numbers. So I'm going to shift gears and get a little bit into trust operations and best practices, some of the things that we suggest from working in a lot of different communities. One is just to go over funding sources that communities are finding more and more ways to fund their trust, which is really fantastic. Clearly, CPA, Community Preservation Act funds are the most common, and a significant percentage of trust communities have CPA as well, although not all. We have some communities where they have inclusionary zoning and they allow for an in lieu of payment in some cases. And in some communities in the bylaw or the ordinance, those in lieu of payments are directed to go to the trust. We even have a community where it's the trust's responsibility to determine what the in lieu of payment is for development. We have communities that have transferred free cash to their housing trust. Communities like Brookline and Truro have done that. Tax title sales. So this becomes a little bit more difficult with the Supreme Court, the more recent Supreme Court case around tax title, but we have in the past, income from tax title sales have been transferred to trust, or properties that have been taken through tax title have been transferred to trust, such as in Chelsea, and they're working on redeveloping some of those for affordable home ownership. There may be developer negotiated fees. You need to be very careful with how you do this, but there have been incidences where there was for example, in Norfolk, there was a friendly 40B home ownership development, and the developer was local, and it was negotiated that $10,000 of the market rate units, the profit from the market rate units, would be directed to the community, and then they directed that to the Affordable Housing Trust. We have one community that's passed a municipal bond. Medfield passed a trust several years ago, and they don't have the Community Preservation Act, but they voted to allow for a $1 million bond to seed their housing trust. I don't think that they have actually drawn on it, but they have that ability. And then Orleans on the Cape has passed a tax override that they see as a permanent tax override. I think it's either $275,000 or $375,000 that the trust can has access to every year. And they're the only trust that I know of that's actually been able to get a line of credit from a bank because they have that type of funding source. There can be donations. There can be donations of land or of cash. There are some communities that are accessing short-term rental fees that are being directed to their trust. Some communities have talked about income from the marijuana tax. I don't know of any that have actually gone through with that, but that's talked about sometimes. And then, of course, as you know, the real estate transfer fee, many communities are hoping to have the ability to do real estate transfer fees for affordable housing. So there are more and more ways that communities are trying to fund their housing trust and their affordable housing efforts, and just making sure that they're not relying on only one source.
Shelley, can I just ask a quick question? Can you clarify? Nantucket recently passed a $6.5 million annual override that goes to their affordable housing trust.
Incredible.
Is that the same kind of tax override that you're talking about that was done in Orleans?
I believe so.
Okay.
Sounds like it. So that's good to know there's a second one.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. So with trust, whether you're brand new or whether you have been around for a bit, we always suggest that you have updated data around the housing needs in your community. So typically, if it's a housing production plan that you've worked on, typically the state sees those as being valid for about 5 years. If you have anything beyond that, we would definitely suggest that you do some updating and that you really use that data to start with setting priorities for your trust. And if there's a particular need that you're wanting to meet in the community, you could, as a trust, create a benchmark. You don't have to do that, but Somerville is a community where their trust ordinance actually requires that a percentage of their funds be used for, I think it's households under 50% of the area at median income. So it's just a benchmark that they have. They have actually put it in their ordinance to make sure that they're not just funding, say, 80% or 100% of area median income, but that they're always investing in much lower income housing as well. So we always suggest with the trustees and that members of other housing boards that you familiarize yourself with the local housing needs. You can also use additional resources like Datatown, a website that MHP has developed and manages, and you can pull different kind of data points from all the different communities in the state. You can also compare communities with each other, and you can pull out different pieces of information like these two graphs, and you can use them as JPEGs. You can freely use them. It's open source. It's for everyone. And along with really becoming familiar with the local needs, we would suggest that particularly those who are in the position of allocating resources towards development or affordable housing, that you get some familiarity about affordable housing finance. And this is not at all about becoming an expert, because it's very complicated and it wouldn't be a very good use of your time anyway. But just to have a general understanding about what it takes to put together affordable housing deals so that you can best structure your resources and how you interact with developers and how you support the process to build affordable housing. So we have the housing toolbox, and it has many past trainings that were online. We have some specifically around affordable housing finance, one that one of my colleagues did. So kind of from the lender perspective and really talking big picture around LIHTC and the many different sources that are needed to put a deal together. We also have a couple that are from the developer perspective. We've had a couple nonprofit developers kind of go through developments and talk about the challenge, the different pieces that they're having to put together, not only from the lender, but also the community and the state requirements. So it can just give you some really good insight to what it really takes to put together affordable housing deals. And another thing that I suggest in communities is that you actually just invite an affordable housing developer to come to one of your meetings, and possibly come to this meeting, this kind of a meeting, and really to walk through a real development pro forma, explain the process to get an actual development done through completion, to share a little bit about the significance of the local community support and why that's so important on the state level, that the state requires it. They want to see local support of developments. So I have had some communities take me up on this, but it can just help you understand better your role in the overall process, the importance of you being engaged early on in a development. And it can also help you structure your funds that you want to that you are wanting to allocate to developments. And next, I would suggest, if you don't yet have a mission statement, that you create one for your trust, and also for your other nonprofit board. For your other housing boards. Not only does this really help focus your work, but it can also really help the community understand how you see your role in the community. And even if you have a mission statement, if you haven't reviewed it recently, you might want to just every few years, just circle back and make sure that it still reflects how you see your role in the community. Of course, these should be kept short and answer things like what you do, how you do it, and who do you do it for. I just pulled up Amherst. Amherst is a community where they felt like it was important in their trust mission to reiterate that they're an instrument of town government. They're not separate from town government, but they are a part of the municipality, and they're really there to promote the town's affordable housing priorities. And then their focus is for the most vulnerable populations. So they're trying to answer those questions in their mission statement. And beyond the mission statement, then we are encouraging trusts more and more to then really spend some time to create a planning framework. So really create a path for you to move forward. Our housing needs are so huge. They're so significant. The resources aren't near enough. And our boards, your volunteers, and very few trusts have more than very limited paid support. So we really urge trusts to take the time to identify, I really am saying 2 to 3 well-defined measurable goals. That oftentimes our housing plans have a lot of goals, and they're really general. I've seen some in housing production plans that are, it's like increase senior housing, like it's so huge. So instead, I'm really trying to encourage trusts to drill down and to create some smart measurable goals. And then once you do that, to then create strategies that will intentionally help support your goals, as well as tasks that get into the specifics that you need to do to meet your strategies. So I'm not going to get too much into this. I did a session on September 21st, and it's on the housing toolbox, so where I get a little bit more specific, but I did want to just bring up a couple of the goals from the 2 goals that Wellfleet's Housing Trust
And Shelley, can
developed.
I just ask that when,
Mhm.
and I think I'll offer to everybody that when I send out the link, when I send out the slide deck and the link to the recording of this meeting, that I'll also get the link to that recorded session from September 21st from Shelley and provide that to you guys. I know we had a number of people on the Vineyard who actually were able to attend that and found it really helpful.
Oh, great. So this was Wellfleet. Wellfleet is a teeny tiny little community on the lower Cape. They have a housing authority that doesn't have any units, but that has managed programs. They have a new housing trust, and then they have a housing committee. And these three housing entities have worked collaboratively to determine the role of each entity. The housing authority has really managed programs, and they've decided that that's what they'll continue doing. The committee has been more focused on advocacy, education, and policy. And they have decided they've focused that the trust will focus on development, affordable housing development. So in keeping with my encouraging of measurable goals and keeping it tight, not having too many, they've created two goals. One, a pretty ambitious goal for a community as small as Wellfleet. I think they have fewer than 3,000 year-round residents, is to add 100 units of low and moderate income rental and homeownership housing units over the next 5 years. And then they came up with 5 different strategies of how they're going to attempt to do that. Issue an RFP for one home at Freeman Ave, provide funding for accessory dwelling unit creation, provide funds to support 46 units at Lawrence Road, so a development that's already in the pipeline, complete 4 units at one site, 8 units at another, and then acquire, so look for a site where they could have at least 20 units being built. So again, I just want to say it's pretty ambitious for a community of the size of Wellfleet. And then their second one is every bit as ambitious as well. It's to raise $1 million a year for 5 years. And then they've come up again with 4 different strategies to help support that goal. Request 80% of short-term rental tax revenue, have an annual request to the CPC, fundraise for donations. So Wellfleet actually has in the summer, they try to take advantage of having so many more summer residents. And they actually have a kind of an old school fundraiser where they are having some sort of event, like they've had concerts, and then they do some education through that as well, but it's a part of raising money. And then to secure 1 to 2 additional revenue sources. So trying to diversify their income with their trust. So again, just an example of creating 2 or 3 specific goals, some very intentional, thoughtful strategies. And then I would suggest a step beyond that of just coming up with task 2 as you're starting to tackle your different strategies. Another thing that we suggest, if you don't already have this, is to create guidelines to really be thoughtful about how you're going to function as a trust fund. So the screenshot is just from Beverly, the city of Beverly. But common elements of guidelines are, so a place to have your mission statement, your goals, your strategies, to outline your roles and your responsibilities in the community. And that can be distinguishing you from other boards as well, their housing boards. You have your goals, but could be a place where you are more specific about the kind of activities that you want to fund as a trust. You could outline any stipulations you have for funding. So one common one would be the income limits that you're interested in funding. So the area median income, your ceiling for that. There could be some language around project monitoring, your expectations around how projects are monitored, reporting back to you as the funder, as a trust funding a development, and then having an application process. So there's clarity about what you expect. A selection criteria of what you're going to consider when you're reviewing applications, and then the application form. Having all this in one place, having clarity, making it easy for people to understand how you're operating as a trust. So we're seeing more and more communities creating this, but I think that these kinds of steps just help create a strong foundation for you to be able to move forward and for there to be clarity in the community as well as with potential applicants about what you expect. So I just wanted to pause to see if there are any questions at this point, if you'd like to stop, or if I should just jump into the kinds of things that you can be funding. Okay.
Lucy, do you see any hands? I think you've got a better view of the screen than I do. I see Steve Cass's hand up.
It's true. Thank you.
It's true. Go ahead, Steve.
This is thank you, Shelley. In your early slide, you mentioned that one source of resources could be donations.
Mm-hmm.
And I assume that could be donations of land as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Have you had experience where people or groups donate land, but try to attach some conditions as to how or where it would be used for eligible activities?
So I don't know of any with trust specifically, but there have been cases where there is an affordability restriction already on land when it's been donated to a community. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, so that could be possible.
Do you think it's a good or a bad idea?
Well, the purpose of a trust is to create and preserve affordable housing for low and moderate income households. So, I mean, the more restrictive that it is, the more challenging it could be. I mean, if it gets really restrictive where it's saying that it has to be housing that's only age restricted affordable housing, or if you're getting much more into the weeds about specificity, I think that could be really challenging, because what you build is oftentimes a reflection of the market, which can change. If it's just for affordability up to a certain AMI, I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. If that's the intent of using the land, I guess that it could be challenging if the land isn't really, if affordable housing isn't really feasible on the site, or if it's not really a good site for affordable housing, then that could just create complications of how do you maintain the land? How do you use it?
I see Philippe's hand up. Shelley, he may be able to speak to this
Yeah.
because IHT deals with this like pretty frequently on the vineyard. Philippe, do you want to address that?
I'm not quite sure. I
Okay,
did
maybe
have a
you don't
question,
have your hand
however.
up for that. Oh, okay,
I
I'm
do.
sorry.
I guess my question was, low and moderate is being referenced as the purpose of who this trust would serve. My question is, can trusts serve above low and moderate, i.e., 80% of their immediate income, and do any currently on the vineyard?
Yes, I do have that answer.
So the municipal, first I'll just start. The Municipal Affordable Housing Trust Fund statute says it's for low and moderate income households, but it doesn't define low and moderate income. So what we've just always suggested is that communities look at existing definitions of low and moderate income. But it does specifically say low and moderate income households. It does not say middle or upper or market rate. It's low and moderate income. But
right.
Laura?
So yeah. So just to clarify, that's under that particular state statute. Not all of our trusts are created under that statute. And then section 38D of Mass General Law specifies that on Nantucket and in Dukes County, our housing authorities shall consider low and moderate income to include up to 150% of area median income, specifically because of our demographics and our high cost of living. So Chilmark, for example, and I know Steve, you're in Chilmark, so your question I think would be answered a little differently than maybe some of the other towns. But Chilmark's housing committee was not created under the state statute that Shelley's talking about. So the Molly Flender Fund is not restricted to low and moderate. It can include year round. It can include middle income. It's created under a different statute. Nantucket's is created under a different statute. Chatham has a filing in with the state to create a different type of trust so they can serve an expanded range. So we have a variety on the island. Edgartown's trust is, I believe Shanette's going to speak to this, can serve up to 150%. One of the other trusts can serve up to 140, and then Oak Bluffs and Tisbury are seeking to bring their trust to 140 or 150% to line up to what DCRHA can serve. So we're in a little bit of an odd situation here on the island because Dukes County and Nantucket are considered unusual circumstances under MGL. Shelley, did you have anything to add to that, or Philippe, did you want to?
The only thing that I might add is that there are different models. So Providence, P-Town created an additional trust. They went to the legislature and created an additional trust that they see as market rate year round, that goes beyond the 100% or 120% of their I think it's a municipal affordable housing trust. So there are different models to respond to that as well.
Shelley, could you actually pull down the screen share for a minute? Because I do see a lot of hands up and this will give a chance.
Sure.
It seems like a great pause point for people to ask questions. And that way we can all see each other. I saw Elaine's hand up and then Shanette, and I can't tell if anyone else has a hand up.
Just
Lucy,
them
are
right
you
now.
seeing me? Okay.
Yep.
So how about Elaine
That's
first
fine.
and then Shanette?
Okay.
Elaine, you've got to unmute.
Shelley, I think we're still seeing a screen share. If you
Yeah.
could pause
Oh.
the,
Okay. I said I was going to ask the same question, and then I think I got an answer, and then I think I didn't get an answer. It sounds like we have different median incomes in different different communities. So I will withdraw my question, and I'll do a little bit more direct research internally. Okay, so thanks for that.
okay, thank you. Shanette?
Hi, my question is in regards to the 5 million that they, Westfield plan to raise. Did they give like a breakdown, or do you have any idea of how they're going at this? Is it only like they're using CPC, they're doing this fundraising, they're going to do bonding? Because if they have a specific amount, they must have like some sort of target way they plan to do this. 'Cause who knows, maybe we could use some of their methods.
Well, so they had a variety of strategies of how they're going to do that. They are requesting the majority of short-term rental income. They'll be requesting funds from the CPC on an annual basis. They will do some fundraising, and then they're searching for one or two other funding sources. So they are looking to piece together different funding sources so that it's not just one source.
Thank you.
Jeanette, I can look up for you too what 80% of Wellfleet's rooms tax would be. I would guess that would be pretty substantial.
Thank you.
Any more questions, or should we go carry on with the slideshow? All right, carry on. Shelley, thank you.
Shelley, you're muted.
Sorry, talking to myself. So the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust Fund statute was modified several years ago to because communities were concerned that the trust statute was more narrow than what the CPA statute allowed in terms of funding. So we oftentimes will talk about use the language of CPA because the trust statute has now been modified so that all of the allowable uses under community housing with the CPA statute are allowable for trusts. This specifically speaks to support, the support verb that's under CPA, but that wasn't specifically called out in the trust statute. So in this graph, you can see with the blue that support is a verb under CPA that's only applies to housing. So the language that I'm going to use is CPA because these statutes are so closely tied. So, and some of the examples that I give were actually funded by the CPC and some of them were the trust, but all of these examples can be funded by either a CPC or a municipal affordable housing trust. So one is acquire, that's one of the CPA verbs. So funds from the trust or CPC can be used to acquire existing housing that may or may not be affordable. In this case, in Barnstable, most of the units were not affordable. And then local funds were used by a nonprofit to acquire the development. And now almost all the units are affordable. A few are market rate because a few households were not income qualified, but most of them are now affordable. We have many examples of trusts specifically managing some kind of buy down program, like typically a small scale homeownership program. And it's typically helping income qualified households access homeownership of existing housing. And then the trust will put in the difference between the sale price, the oftentimes a negotiated sale price, and what makes it affordable for household earning up to 80% or 100%, whatever the program parameters are. These kinds of programs, as you can imagine, are very costly per unit. There's a very high subsidy per unit. And so these programs rarely add more than 1 to 3 units a year, because you also rely on a market where you're having more modest size housing come on the market that could be accessed by income qualified folks. We see many communities, many trusts engaged in supporting new creation of affordable housing. And oftentimes these are actually community driven developments. In Norwell, the site had been a police station, that had been voted as surplus. And then Norwell actually transferred the site to the Affordable Housing Trust, who then managed some of the pre-development work and releasing a request for proposals. And now there are 18 units of age restricted housing there. In Westport, this was, the trust was heavily engaged in driving this development over many years. It took many years to get to the point of occupancy. There had been a municipal site, then the trust helped to support purchasing an adjacent site that gave access to the municipal parcel. And then there was pre-development work that the trust supported. And then the trust also put funds into the development when the developer was chosen. So to help the developer receive low-income housing tax credits and other state and federal resources. And then in Brewster, this was a new development on housing authority land that was surplus. And the community worked very closely to help support this development moving forward. One key thing that they did was apply for a Mass Works grant that helped to fund roads, and I believe connecting the site to sewer, I believe, as well, along with local contribution of funds. So we're seeing many more trusts actively engaged with disposing of municipal land for affordable housing or working with housing authorities to develop affordable housing. Sometimes, like in Norwell, the land is transferred to the trust. In most cases, it's just that the trust is actively engaged in the process. And then there are many examples of existing buildings being reused for affordable housing, as you likely have examples in your communities. In Middleborough, this had been a shoe factory at one point, and a couple nonprofits were able to access public resources to redevelop it into affordable rental housing. Middleborough was a brand new CPA community at the time. They didn't have that many resources, so they contributed $25,000, which is what they could do at that time. And it was enough for the state to fund the development. In Williamstown, the development, that site was an old mill building that a developer renovated and then did some added some additional part to the building. And then schools, there are many examples of schools being reused for affordable housing. And usually this entails an addition onto the building to make it a size that's that makes it a financially feasible development. In the Auburn photo, you might be able to tell that the portion at the back is the new part of the building. And in CPA with preservation, because you all have CPA, under CPA, you cannot use CPA funds to rehab units unless it was CPA funds that acquired or created the units. So it makes it difficult with housing authorities where the developments were built well before CPA was around. So the definition of preservation under CPA is actually a really high bar. It's the protection of personal or real property from injury, harm, or destruction. This is not rehab. Years ago, DHCD, the state, now HLC, put together a memo helping to clarify, specifically for housing authorities, the difference between preserve and rehab, as well as maintenance. And maintenance is never allowed with CPA funds. Because the trust statute came after the CPA statute, and the impetus to have the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust statute really was because more and more communities had CPA funds. We do use the definition in CPA to inform the trust efforts. However, preservation is not technically defined in the trust statute. So when we're using CPA funds, for sure, one example of protecting real property from injury or harm is this example in Gloucester, where the housing authority had a building where one unit was already shuttered because there was leaking. The roof was old, and so no one could live in that unit. Other units were at risk. And so this was considered high to the bar of preservation, that CPA funds could be used to help preserve these units that were being no longer livable. So the housing authority applied for some CPA funds to use with supplement state modernization formula funding to replace a 30-year-old roof, to make sure that this unit could come online and that others were not lost. But typically, at least under CPA, when we consider preservation, we typically are thinking about affordability restrictions that are set to expire. So we do have affordable housing trusts that are a part of monitoring expiring use and engaged in conversation around how to extend affordability. This is just an example in Amherst of a large development where 41 of the units were affordable. But the units, the affordability was set to expire. The 15 years were up. It was with mass housing financing, and the community was concerned about losing these units. And so they started considering a strategy. The owner was not interested in extending the affordability, but was open to talking with a large developer, Beacon Communities, that has a lot of experience in this field. Beacon negotiated purchasing the development, and then Amherst CPC, the CPA, they bonded $1.25 million of CPA funds. Now, a trust wouldn't be able to bond this way, but a trust could be engaged with the process, with monitoring, and helping to negotiate this kind of preservation of units. And then under support, the support verb, the kinds of activities that have been considered allowable in the past has been funding pre-development work on municipal sites to help move them towards bringing in a development, updating housing plans, and rental assistance is explicitly allowed in the CPA statute, and therefore something that trusts can engage in. And in fact, during the pandemic, the early months of the pandemic, it was oftentimes the housing trust that initiated emergency rent assistance in a variety of communities. So I want to be sensitive to your time.
Shelley, I just want to
yep.
interject there. If you can go back to
Mhm.
that slide, this speaks directly to Victor's question when we first
Mhm.
logged on. Housing plans and needs assessment. So you can use the funds for housing plans and needs assessment. We're looking to update the 2020 housing needs assessment, and I just put a request out to the trusts. So Shelley's answer is yes, you can use those funds.
Historically, that has been seen as allowable. You could find some different of opinion, but historically that has been considered allowable, and there have been cases of DOR even.
I wasn't questioning about trust funds, because I think the non-CPC trust funds can be used for that, is my thought. It was, but my question was the CPC portion of trust funds.
Oh, so
to be
what we're saying is that under support with CPA, that it matches both with CPA and with a trust, that
Okay,
historically these have been uses that have been considered allowable under support, which is a unique category specifically for housing, understanding the complexity of housing and the needs for additional support for housing.
Okay, thank you.
Of course,
Great.
you want to make sure that your community is comfortable with that, because ultimately it's your decision of how you're using CPA funds. But
Yep, I understand.
Yep. Okay.
I see a question from Heidi. Heidi, you're on mute. There you go.
So specifically to that same question that Victor raised, because something came up this past year in Tisbury, they were looking at the separate monies that were within the trust fund, CPA funded, and the town itself puts in a little less than 40,000 per year. And so there was a suggestion that town money could be used, not however they wanted, but it wasn't going to correlate with the CPA legislation. And so I just want to be very clear that indeed the trust money does have to meet the CPA legislation for eligibility. Is that correct?
So when CPA funds are transferred to a trust, all of the restrictions or requirements of CPA funds follow the money to the trust.
Okay,
Does that answer that for you?
partly, but if the trust has other sources of funding, let's say it's a bake sale. Can that bake sale money be used for essentially whatever the trust wants to, as long as it's being funding affordable housing?
Well,
Does
so
it-
then you would just need to, it would need to follow the municipal, that your trusts, either the municipal affordable housing statute,
Right.
or there might be some modifications in your local bylaw that you need to follow.
Okay, as I understood it, the trust statute corresponds to the CPA statute now. That's what I'm kind of trying to.
Okay, sorry. So it's just that all of the allowable activities under CPA for community housing
Mhm.
are now activities that the trust can engage in. There had been
Okay.
an issue in the past
Okay.
that communities were wanting to do activities that fell under support. Trusts
Right,
were wanting to
okay.
do activities that fell under support,
Yeah.
but the trust statute didn't specifically allow support similar to CPA.
Mhm.
So the
Okay.
modification was now everything that's allowable under CPA, a trust can engage in, can
Mhm.
fund.
Mhm.
If it's CPA funds, then it also needs to follow all the other parameters of CPA.
Mhm.
But you can use other funds to do CPA eligible activities, not using CPA funds. Is that getting
Yeah.
confusing? Does that make
Of
sense?
course, it's housing. It's confusing.
Well, and
I think-
I've been engaged in this kind of work for so many years, and you would think that it would get easier and easier, but then like different things get up, people ask questions in different angles. It's like, it just
Sure,
is. It's,
Sure, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Be Fair has her hand up.
Yeah, to follow up on Heidi's question, you're saying that all CPA activities are eligible for trusts, but can trusts also do other things with that other money, such as, for example, support 150% income household development?
So I am not going to speak as specifically as you might want me to speak. We just will reiterate that if your trust is organized under the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust Fund statute, that it says low and moderate income. And we suggest that communities define that for themselves and that you look at existing definitions. And if you're going to go beyond, for example, the state's Affordable Housing Trust Fund goes to 110%, defines moderate income up to 110% AMI. If you're going to go beyond that, we just suggest that you have town council involved, that you are making the case for that you kind of do your due diligence to decide that for your community. We're not going to say, no, you can't. Yes, you can. That's just not the role that MHP is going to take.
Thank you.
I can clarify that a little bit more, B. So on the island, so say that if the trust is receiving funds from, say, the rooms tax, the rooms tax revenue is not restricted to serve any AMI at all. It can be used for any. So the only restriction would be whatever the trust itself is restricted to serving. So if you're in a town where your trust is restricted to serving up to 150% of area median income, any revenue that's coming from an unrestricted revenue source is only subject to the restrictions of your trust. So Nantucket's trust is restricted to serve up to 200% of area median income. If they have general fund revenue coming into their trust or rooms tax revenue coming into their trust, they can decide how they're going to allocate. They can use it for 30% of AMI. They can use it for 80% of AMI. They can use it for 150%. They can use it for a deed restricted year-round project that has no AMI restriction on it, but is deed restricted to year-round because that's in the parameters of their trust. Is that more clear?
Very, thank you.
Okay, so in the interest of your time, the last section is just some suggestions, tips for working across housing boards, working collaboratively. So one is that in identifying housing needs, that this should never be done in a vacuum. It shouldn't just be one entity doing this, that all of your housing boards should be engaged in this. we suggest that you kick off your work with current data that you're always working with as current data as possible, that's reasonable, to get a really good view of the housing landscape in your community, and that your different housing boards and boards beyond that, that there's familiarity and understanding of what these needs are, and that you're kind of telling the same story in the community using the same data. And that this just not be done in a vacuum, that it shouldn't be a plan that just sits on the fence, but that you really should be educating people in the community, educating key boards around the most critical data points that you're discovering, the housing needs in your community. Second thing is that CPAs can definitely fund housing trusts. That is allowed. In some cases, the housing trust is required to apply for a specific program or project. There are CPCs that allow for trust to apply for no specific purpose, which can be very helpful to have some funds in their account. So as developments come up, that the trust can be flexible and respond to that in a way that CPCs can't, because the CPC has to go to town meeting in a town structure. And then we have some communities where they transfer, the CPC transfers a set amount each year. Some communities might transfer the 10% that has to be set aside for housing. That might be transferred to the trust. In a community like Cambridge, they transfer 80% of their CPA funds to their housing trust every year, because they just have identified that housing as the key issue in the community. And then they use their housing trust as pretty much the community housing arm of the CPC. Somerville transfers about 45% of their housing funds to their CPC funds to, not just housing funds, the CPC funds to their trust every year. So it looks a little bit different in different communities, but having some flexibility where the trust can have some money in there, some flexible funds in their account, can be incredibly helpful, particularly if you're really wanting to support affordable housing development. Again, we always suggest grant agreements, that there's clarity when you're allocating funds, even if it's between the CPC and the trust. And you always want to include clarification about how, at what point funds should come back to the CPC or come back to the trust. Make sure that that's clear. One thing is just to encourage you to decide critical elements up front. So if you have multiple housing boards, have conversations about how will your boards work together. What is the niche or the focus of each of your different boards? What do you need from each other? How are you going to communicate with each other? If you're creating, it can be helpful to create, to understand the goals of each board and your strategy, so that you're not stepping on toes, so that there's some accountability among boards. And then one thing is CPA funds. If your trust is receiving CPA funds, to be clear about whether those CPA funds can be used to support administrative support for your trust. Sometimes that is an issue in communities. 5, again, just reporting back, making sure that your trust is reporting back to your CPC, that there's good reporting between your boards. And I'm sorry, there's some duplication here. I'm very sorry. This is just an example of how Manchester had an exercise that they did of coming up with different housing strategies in the community. And then some that were shorter term, some are longer term, and then they identified the lead board. It could also include a housing authority. It can perhaps include a nonprofit as well. But this was just a way that they structured this kind of a conversation about who's doing what, who is the lead, helping to establish some accountability and making sure that they weren't stepping on each other's toes. And
I
then,
love this. Wait, can we pause here for a second,
Yeah.
Shelley? Can you go back to that? You're not repeating anything. This is something that we're not seeing on the Vineyard that we're talking about quite a lot, is direct coordination between all the town boards in cohesive planning across the town and who's responsible for what. So I love this grid and the fact that you're looking at up to a 5-year plan. So I'd really encourage, when I send the slide deck out, for everyone to look through this and specifically focus on this and think about what a grid would look like for your community.
It's great. And you could potentially have something that's island wide as well, that communities that maybe some housing strategies should be looked at regionally, and that you have a conversation around that as well. and incorporate that somehow. And then, again, I can't repeat this enough, of just ensure transparency in your efforts between all of your housing boards and the community. That we all know that housing development and affordable housing development in particular can be very controversial. Don't make it difficult for people to understand what you're doing, what you're working on, what your goals are. Sometimes joint board appointments are helpful with communication. Identify the different boards that you need to be reporting back to. Occasionally, communities have joint board meetings between the trust and the CPC, for example, like maybe once a year to check in. Promote your efforts when you're funding, supporting different developments or programs. Let people know about it and use your webpage to put your information out there. Make your trust bylaw easy for people to access, your goals, your who sits on your trust, who supports your trust if you have a staff person that helps support your efforts. So just don't make it difficult for people to learn about what you're doing. And then as different entities, really try to center more housing instead of competing with each other, which unfortunately we see in communities between CPCs, between trusts, defensiveness, possessiveness. Like, instead of that, try to complement each other's efforts to increase the supply of affordable housing. Really center your efforts on the goal of more housing because it's so in such dire need. And then another thing that boards can do together is to really work on creating a supportive culture, which is a phrase that someone from Amherst brought up at a training many years ago, but this idea of creating a culture of support for housing. And this is just one resource. It's actually several years old now, but if you just Google, you don't have to live here. It's Tiffany Manuel that you may have heard of through some of Chapa's work. A document that she developed with another entity several years ago, but they were testing housing messages in the market to see what backfires and why. And some of the things that they learned were balancing people with places and systems. Don't just talk about the people that need affordable housing, but what the systems and the places that make it difficult for so many people to find housing that they can afford, and telling the story of us and not them, so that we're making sure that we're including them, that these are people who are part of our community, they're us. Connecting housing to other social issues. We know that educational outcomes improve, health outcomes improve when people have access to safe, affordable housing. We know that where you live, that it affects your life opportunities. And you could consider language that you use. So if you're not doing this already, but just how do you talk about the need in your community, but also island-wide? And are you using similar language because your needs are so similar and your economy is so dependent on each community? And then very lastly, to wrap up, the things that I like to remind us is that when you're doing this work, when you have an affordable housing trust, to really consider your local infrastructure, the needs, but also the existing resources, to make sure that you're identifying kind of a niche, that you're not duplicating efforts. Really develop goals that reflect identified needs, not just like preferences of people, but really that you're addressing identified needs. And then be real about your capacity, your volunteer boards. Most of you have very limited paid staff support. So just be really realistic about what you can do. And we have many online resources. We have an operations manual for trust that was just updated. This finally came out in August or September. We have Data Town, Housing Toolbox, many resources to help support you, as well as us as staff, that you're welcome to reach out to me directly or your board. I'm going to stop sharing. But we want to support all of you. So I will get the PDF of the slides to Lara, as well as a couple other resources, links for you to access additional trainings. And I'm happy to stick around if anyone wants for more questions, or I'm not sure what your process is.
I actually have a follow-up question, but I also wanted to let the CPCs know that Stuart Saganor, who is the head of the CPC Coalition for the state, has done workshops with Shelley. So I will send you guys a link to a workshop they did together. Stuart would be delighted to do a virtual session with the Martha's Vineyard CPCs. It has to be after the first of the year. but he can also do a joint session with Shelley that would really educate the CPCs on how to leverage your contributions to maximize state funding, because that's what we're really talking about here. And I was going to ask if Shelley could just elaborate on that a little bit, because you touched on it in one of the slides. And I was wondering if you could, it's such a huge issue right now. And that timely leveraging of funding commitment in order to get the maximum in state funding is a place where CPCs and Housing Trust, where it's absolutely critical that the two groups are working together and communicating clearly. Shelley, would you mind just like articulating that a little bit?
Yep. So the state really looks to the state looks for community support of housing developments that come before them for funding. So they want to see that the community is supporting the development. This is usually shown by a financial contribution. It's not just a financial contribution. There are other ways that the community can show local support. The community can donate land towards a development. The community can waive fees, permitting and development fees. There are a variety of ways that communities can show local support, but that is required. And because of the cost of affordable housing, their developers always have gaps. They're always having to piece together many different funding sources. So the local contribution is critical to be early, because they take that to the state when they apply for state resources. They need to show the local contribution. So it isn't that you're releasing the funds, but you're allocating it towards the development. You're showing support of the development. And partly of why I suggest that trusts specifically engage with an affordable housing developer is to better learn this sequence and this process. But just a heads up, the major funding round, the state has one major funding round. There are a couple other smaller ones, but the major funding round is one that starts with a pre-application typically in November. So a developer has to submit a pre-application of what the proposal is, what the development is. And then the state will invite them, if the state wants to submit a full application that this year is due on February 15th in 2024. So it's one shot that you get once a year. So if a development isn't far enough along, if a local contribution hasn't been allocated, then it can put a development off an entire year, even if the development is ready to apply to the state. So these are just things that are beneficial for trusts and CPCs to understand, so that if you're really wanting to support affordable housing development, that you can make sure that your process follows the state process. Because the local contribution is typically, unless it's a really small development, typically the local contribution is a tiny fraction of the total development cost of all the resources that a developer needs to piece together. And we have a couple different trainings that dig into this a little bit. So that are on the Housing Toolbox. So I'll make sure that I highlight links to those, Laura, if folks want to dig in a little bit more to kind of the funding process. But I would just reiterate that I would encourage you to invite Philippe to come to a future meeting like this, and to really walk you through the process, just so that you have an understanding of the myriad of pressures that a developer is putting together, and where you fit as the community in that process.
Great, thank you, Shelley. And I see Philippe's hand up, and then Heidi. So Philippe.
Thanks, Shelley. And Lori, I think you summarized it really well. For those of you who have received CPC applications from the Island Housing Trust this year, it's by far the most that we've requested in any one year. 3 of the projects include applications to all 6 towns. The host towns taking on a greater percentage of the request. And for that reason, if the towns are interested in investing in these projects, we have close to 130 units of housing, mostly rental, that we're developing and we're leveraging, as was mentioned, a lot of state monies for what the towns are investing. It's important to consider bonding. because the availability of funds is just not going to be sufficient in order
Mhm.
to meet the need. So Shelley, I don't know, do you have information that can help town CPCs and housing trusts in terms of walking them through what is necessary in the mechanics of bonding, but also what would be required in order to get the political will to do that at annual town meeting?
So one of the trainings that Laura referenced is one that we did, I think it was last year, with Stuart Saganor and Orleans about bonding for affordable housing development. So it's a training that will be much more articulate than I could be around the in and outs of that. So that's one of the trainings that we're going to send the link to for this group here. I think that that's a really great starting point because they get into the nuts and bolts of how to do it. And it's been done a lot across the state for open space, and we're starting to see more bonding for housing.
Nantucket's doing a tremendous amount of bonding for housing. And a lot out of state, this is really like, it's a huge tool because it allows the town to dictate more of what the development looks like. So I'll send that link out. And then if there's interest for specific training for the Martha's Vineyard CPCs and housing trusts on this topic, then please let me know and I can connect with Shelley and Stuart and they can offer a joint training that's specific to the island. Heidi had her hand up next. Heidi?
Hey, so 8 or 9 years ago, there was kind of a regional effort to get all the CPAs to talk to each other on the island. And it kind of fell apart maybe 5, 6 years ago. And I'm just hoping with this kind of nice turnout that Laura, you put together, and Shelley, thank you again. Your help is invaluable. I think it might be a good time to try to get the island CPAs to work together again, because this isn't just one town's problem. We all know that. But Laura, would it be maybe possible for your MVC to take that on, or does the select boards have to request that? There are different rules you guys have that.
Yeah, so I think Lucy, you can probably help me out with this because I haven't worked directly with the CPCs yet, but yes, a direct request to the commission saying, can you assist us in convening, all the island CPCs to discuss, certain issues, and could you also provide us with support for trainings? I'm already talking with Stuart about, being available after January 1st. So yeah, those letters would be super.
That would be so terrific.
Yeah, so Heidi, I don't know if you can connect with all the other admins, the CPC admins, and just ask them if they'll ask their boards to put that request in.
And
then
actually, yeah, we've been reaching out just recently to all the different CPAs because it kind of seems at this point, with the housing issues, that we're all kind of going our own way, which isn't helpful. So great, Lucy.
Well,
you want to get back?
Thank you. And I do want, Lucy, did you have anything to add to that procedurally? Did I convey that
No, I think
properly?
you nailed it.
Okay, great. Thanks. And I do want to say one of the reasons that we put this together is because there seems to be a wide discrepancy from town to town as to what the CPC thinks its role is and how active the affordable housing trusts are. Edgartown, for instance, has an extremely active affordable housing trust that's meeting on a regular basis. Tisbury, I had trouble actually finding anything about the Affordable Housing Trust on their website. So it's really important, I would stress, that all this information is public facing. Edgartown, for instance, you cannot find a listing for the Community Preservation Committee with its information on the town website. So I would encourage anyone who's here from the town of Edgartown, Jeanette, I see you on from the trust and the committee, but that information is not accessible on the website. And if it's not public facing, it makes it extremely difficult for applicants, and also super difficult for someone like Stuart Saganor, who was actually trying to get in touch with the CPC in Edgartown this week, and for me, who's putting workshops together, and for someone like Heidi, who's trying to reach an admin and there's nothing listed. Same with the Affordable Housing Trust. It really, that public facing piece, when it's listed on the website, it's the simplest way to just open communication channels easily. And then I do think, you know, there's also, I've seen a real variety in the understanding in the CPCs of what their role is in supporting affordable housing, and also what the communication pathways are. So for instance, if someone's putting in a request to a CPC that's housing related in your town, do they need to go to the Affordable Housing Committee first and get sponsorship, and then have the Affordable Housing Committee put the recommendation into the CPC? If that's the case, that needs to be articulated in a public facing way so that everyone coming to you knows how they're supposed to proceed. You know, we saw a really unfortunate communication breakdown with Harbor Homes, which has not been funded by Edgartown's CPC for multiple years because the request did not come through the Affordable Housing Committee or the Affordable Housing Trust, which was not part of the loop. So that's a basic communication breakdown that, you know, good communication between the boards can easily eliminate. Were there any more questions? Or Heidi, I see you waving your hand. Was that just a thumbs up? Okay, thanks. Maria, as a select board member, I hate to put you on the spot, but do you have questions as a select board member?
Not at the moment, but this has been very informative and useful, and I need to make sure that all our boards are working together. You know, I need to check on that.
Super, thank you. Anybody else? Seeing no takers, I would say a huge thank you to Shelley for an incredibly informative workshop. And just a big thank you to everyone from the towns who turned out for this. I see a lot of like familiar faces and people who really are, you know, incredibly dedicated to your community. So thank you all for coming out to talk about working together. And I will look forward to sending all this information out to you guys tomorrow. And hopefully the recording of this will also be posted. What's tomorrow? Is tomorrow Thursday already?
Yep.
Lucy, we'll have to try to post it before the weekend. So if you can help me remember, and we'll get everything out to you guys tomorrow.
Thank you so much for letting me be here. It's been great to be with you.
Shelley,
you.
it's a pleasure, and I'm sure we will be bringing you back.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Fantastic.
Have a great night.